A man wakes up in an abandoned mine with no memory. As he searches for answers, he discovers mysterious symbols on the walls that seem to tell his own story. Each step reveals dark secrets from a past that perhaps should have remained buried. A journey of self-discovery where the line between redemption and condemnation is as thin as dust. Prepare to question the nature of guilt in this gripping story. Subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. At the breaking of dawn, when the wind whispered forgotten promises across the dunes, the secret valley ranch stretched under, a vast indifferent sky. The sun, still low on the horizon, painted the clouds in shades of rust and old gold, reflecting the harshness of that land. The dust, a constant companion, rose in lazy swirls with every step of the cowhands and every stronger gust of the breeze that came from the east, carrying with it the dry scent of sun-scorched grass and the promise of another scorching day. The foreman, a man with skin tanned by the elements and eyes marked by long years under the unforgiving sky, stood by the fence, watching the cattle. His name was John Smith, but in those lands, where full names mattered less than reputation and willpower, he was simply Smith. He was in his early 40s, an age that seemed much older under the weight of a life of hard work and silent worries. His hair, once brown, already showed the first white strands mingling with his stubble, and his posture was that of a solitary oak on the plains, firm, resilient, but with visible scars on its bark. Smith loved that land with a quiet, deep passion, the same passion with which a wolf loves its den and hunting territory. He protected it with the vigilance of a hawk and the stubbornness of an old buffalo. The ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was the refuge, the sustenance, and the legacy he had built from nothing, with the sweat and blood of loyal men who followed him, not for money, but for respect. There was a raw and honest camaraderie among them, forged in shared hardship. His greatest pride was ensuring that those men and their families had what they needed, even if it meant putting himself at risk. Distrust of outsiders wasn't a whim, but a hard lesson learned from the many times good faith had been exploited on that lawless frontier. And the stubbornness, well, the stubbornness was the rock he leaned on when everything else seemed to crumble. It was the refusal to yield, to break, to be tamed by the adversities that came with the same fury as a hungry coyote on a cold night. But there was something that weighed on Smith, a shadow that never completely disappeared, even under the brightest sun. It was the guilt over the loss of his younger brother, David. 15 winters had passed since the blizzard that separated them in the mountains. John, then an impulsive young man, had made a mistake, a fatal mistake that cost his brother's life, or so he believed. The memory of that icy day haunted him, and the ranch, the success he had built, felt partly like a penance, a silent attempt to honor the life he couldn't save. He never spoke about David, but the absence was a hole in his soul, a silence that only the wind seemed to understand. The frontier territory was a melting pot of changes. The steel rails of the railroad advanced relentlessly westward, promising to connect the isolation of the frontier to the civilized world. For some, it was the promise of prosperity, of new opportunities. For others, it was an invasion, the destruction of a way of life that had been built on self-sufficiency and respect for the untamed vastness of the land. The small community that served the ranch and other neighboring properties was a microcosm of this tension. The saloon, a creaking wooden building with a crooked facade, was the nerve center, where news and rumors spread like wildfire through dry grass. The air inside was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat, and old wood. Every floorboard seemed to have a story to tell under the soles of boots. Outside, the wind never stopped. Its constant whisper among the cacti and stones sounded like an ancient murmur, a warning that the land possessed a memory of its own, guarding secrets beneath its layers of dust and rock. It was in this setting that the traveling doctor arrived. Her name was Mary Johnson. She didn't fit easily into the landscape. Young, with delicate features that contrasted with the firmness of her hands and the determination in her blue eyes, she carried a cracked leather satchel that seemed to contain all known medical knowledge. The reason for her presence in those Distant lands was personal and painful. Her father, a good and hard-working man, had succumbed to an illness that she believed could have been treated if medical assistance had been available. The loss drove her to study, to defy the social conventions that dictated medicine was a profession for men, and to promise herself that as long as she had strength, she would travel to the far reaches of the territory, bringing relief and healing to those in need, without distinction of wealth or status. She traveled on horseback, under the sun that beat down like an iron hammer against her wide-brimmed hat, covering long distances between isolated properties, her hands full of balms, bandages, and hope. The tension between Smith and Mary Johnson was immediate and almost tangible. He saw her for the first time in the village, treating a cowhand who had broken his arm falling from a horse. Her skill and calm impressed him, despite his instinctive distrust. A few days later, an accident with a sharp tool left a deep cut on his own arm. The ranch cook, an old mixed-race man named Samuel with trembling hands and nearly blind eyes, tried to care for the wound with home remedies. Mary Johnson, who was passing nearby on her way to another farm, saw the scene and approached, offering help. "I can clean that properly and prevent infection," she said, her voice calm but with a subtle authority. Smith recoiled, his gaze a mixture of wounded pride and reluctance. "I appreciate it, miss, but we manage here. Men of this land heal like oaks grow, slowly and on their own," he replied, his voice hoarse. Her eyes narrowed slightly in silent disapproval, but she didn't insist. That first encounter was a clash of worlds, a collision between deep-rooted tradition and a new force that refused to be ignored. Smith felt strangely disturbed by her gentle firmness. He, accustomed to imposing his will, found resistance where he least expected it. It was like trying to bend a young cottonwood branch, flexible, but resistant to breaking. The first major twist in the plot arose, not from a human enemy, but from the wild nature. A massive sandstorm, unlike any the region had seen in years, swallowed the ranch and the village for 3 days. The sky turned dark orange, then red, and finally, an oppressive darkness that blocked visibility a few feet away. The wind howled like a vengeful spirit, whipping sand against the wooden walls of the ranch with the force of thousands of needles. The cattle, terrified, crowded into the corrals, lowing in panic. Fine dust seeped through every crack, covering everything with a suffocating layer. Water scarcity, always a concern, became critical. The claustrophobia of the creaking walls under the wind's pressure, the constant sound, and the uncertainty created a cauldron of tensions among the cowhands. It was in this oppressive environment that the doctor appeared. She had gotten lost during a visit to a neighboring farm when the storm began, her terrified horse having left her near the ranch. Smith, reluctantly, had no choice but to offer shelter. His distrust battled the code of Western hospitality, a code as old as the distant mountains. Under that roof, trapped together, the tense silence between Smith and Mary Johnson was almost as palpable as the sand in the air. The forced coexistence under the siege of the storm began to erode the barriers they had erected. Mary Johnson, with her unwavering calm and her willingness to help wherever needed, whether readjusting a bandage on a cowhand or helping Samuel prepare dinner in the smoky kitchen, began to earn the silent respect of the ranch hands. Smith watched. He noticed how she spoke to Samuel, whose eyesight was gradually failing, with a patience and kindness he rarely saw. He also observed during a particularly tense night when the wind seemed intent on tearing off the roof, how he himself, instinctively, began to recite ancient verses of a poem his mother had taught him to calm the frightened horses in the stable. Mary Johnson, sitting near the fireplace with a thoughtful expression, listened. That night, under the flickering light of the lanterns, they shared stories. He, concisely and without many details, mentioned the blizzard and the loss of his brother. The guilt, usually kept under lock and key, escaped in a few murmured sentences. She, in turn, spoke about the pain of losing her father and the difficult path she had chosen, defying her family's expectations to become a doctor. It was a crucial moment, a silent rescue of their isolated souls. a glimpse into the deeper layers that hid behind their facades. The storm outside seemed like a metaphor for the turbulence they both carried within them. The second obstacle manifested shortly after the storm, when the sky cleared, revealing a landscape covered in sand dunes and minor damage to the ranch buildings. Life tried to return to normal. But normalcy was broken by the arrival of two well-dressed men from the big city, bankers. They came to assess the lands, but the real objective was clear: collect the debt the ranch had accumulated for years. Smith had managed the property efficiently, but a series of harsh winters and dry summers had drained resources. He had hidden the true extent of the debt from his cowhands, fearing it would undermine morale. The presence of the bankers, with their thick wool suits out of place in the dust and their calculating gazes, was an affront to that way of life. They spoke in numbers, in mortgages and deadlines, as if the land were just an asset on a spreadsheet, and not the home to men and women who had poured their sweat into it. Mary Johnson was present during the tense visit, treating a cut on one of the cowhands' hands. She observed the stiffness in Smith's body, the weight that seemed to have fallen on his shoulders. She could feel the pressure, the subtle fear beneath his defiant posture. He was like a cornered bull ready for a fight, but aware of the limits of his strength. Meanwhile, in the small community, the seeds of discord were being planted. A local merchant, an ambitious and unscrupulous man named William Davis, was plotting. Son of poor immigrants, he had risen in life through often shady dealings. He saw the arrival of the railroad not just as an opportunity, but as a chance to consolidate his power. He was quietly buying undervalued properties in the hope of selling them for a huge profit when the railroad passed through. His motivation was clear: transform himself from an outcast into a man of influence, the kind of man big city bankers respected, and he didn't care about the means. He began spreading rumors about the financial difficulty of Smith's ranch and other properties, trying to create panic and force sales. Worse, he began to manipulate the water scarcity during the approaching dry season, buying the rights to wells on smaller properties and closing off access, hoping to force neighbors to sell their land for any price. The aging sheriff, George Wilson, watched it all with a mix of weariness and concern. His badge, polished by the years, weighed increasingly heavy on his chest. He represented the old Western order, an unwritten code of honor, verbal commitment, and resolving conflicts with wisdom, not unnecessary violence. His central concern was maintaining peace while progress, symbolized by the steel rails, advanced, inexorably turning traditions into relics and codes of honor into mere memories. He had known Smith for years, respected his honesty and commitment to his people. He distrusted Davis, smelled greed and disloyalty coming from him, but as long as the merchant operated within the thin limits of the law, there was little the sheriff could do. A third twist occurred, offering a ray of hope amidst the financial clouds. A young ranch hand, a quiet and observant young man named Jimmy, was exploring a distant creek on the higher lands of the ranch, looking for fresh pasture for some cattle. He noticed something shining in the shallow water. They were small gold nuggets. The news, initially kept secret between Jimmy and Smith, offered a real hope of financial salvation. The gold, even in small amounts, might be enough to pay off the debt and ward off the bankers. But it also brought a huge risk. The risk of attracting unwanted attention, of turning the relative peace of the valley into a wild gold rush, full of bandits and speculators. The news of the gold was like a spark in gunpowder, with the potential both to illuminate the path or cause an explosion. The drought, the worst in decades, began to tighten its fist over the region. The sun, which had previously beaten down, like a hammer, now felt like a giant brazier in the sky. The land cracked, the cisterns dried up, and the few springs that existed turned into thin trickles of water or disappeared completely. The cattle, skeletal, lowed weakly under the unforgiving sun. The atmosphere was heavy, the air vibrating with heat and the lack of moisture. The smell of dry earth and dust was everywhere. Smith felt the weight of this calamity personally. His inability to provide water for his animals and his men was a failure at his core as foreman. He decided to organize an expedition to find water in higher lands, on the slopes of the distant mountains, where perhaps there were springs the drought hadn't yet reached. He left the ranch in the care of his second-in-command, a trustworthy man named Tom, and set out with a few cowhands. The journey would be long and dangerous, a shot in the dark in search of a mirage that had become a desperate necessity. His departure, in the midst of the crisis, left a leadership vacuum and increased tension on the ranch. He left with a heavy heart, feeling like an exhausted deer seeking the last water source before collapsing. During the foreman's absence, life on the ranch became even more precarious. Hope diminished with each passing day without news. It was during this period that Mary Johnson, caring for Samuel, who was feeling increasingly weak, found old documents hidden in a wooden box under his bed. They were property transfer papers and old correspondence, revealing that the ranch's ownership had been acquired under questionable circumstances by the previous owner, Smith's father. There was mention of undue pressure and a dispute with a neighbor over boundaries and water rights. The revelation was shocking and cast a wave of uncertainty over the legitimacy of the ranch's ownership by Smith. If the ownership were contested, everything he had built would be at risk, and the debt to the bankers could be demanded immediately. Mary Johnson kept the documents, unsure if or how she should use them. The information was a double-edged sword. It could explain part of Smith's history, but also destroy him. She felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders, a burden she didn't expect to carry. While the drought tightened its grip and Smith was away, William Davis intensified his pressure. He appeared at the ranch, offering foreman Tom a ridiculous sum for passage rights through the property, ostensibly to facilitate the transport of supplies, but in reality to ensure the railroad could pass through there, increasing the value of his own neighboring lands. He promised artesian wells as compensation, a tempting offer in the midst of the drought, but which came with conditions that would limit water access for others. Davis's offer divided the small community and the cowhands themselves. Some, desperate for water, were inclined to accept. Others, loyal to Smith and distrustful of Davis, resisted. The internal conflict on the ranch intensified. Follow the code of honor and wait for Smith, risking thirst, or yield to pressure and ensure immediate survival, disrespecting the foreman and perhaps themselves. Smith's absence made this decision even more torturous. His journey in search of water seemed increasingly like a search for something deeper, the strength to resist when the whole world conspires against you. A fourth major twist shook the ranch when a stranger arrived, mounted on a lean, dust-covered horse. He was tall and thin, with piercing eyes that seemed to have seen too much. His features, hardened by years of life on the frontier, barely resembled the young man abandoned in the blizzard. But there was something in his gaze, a familiar intensity, that made Mary Johnson's heart skip a beat. He claimed to be David, Smith's lost brother. The news spread like wildfire. David, alive after so many years? Uncertainty hung in the air. The stranger's intentions remained obscure, seeking reconciliation or revenge for the abandonment. Sheriff Wilson, with his calm wisdom, observed the newcomer, trying to read the truth in his tired eyes. David's arrival put Smith, who returned from the expedition without total success in finding abundant water, in an emotionally devastating situation. The latent guilt of 15 years erupted like an open wound. He looked at the man before him, trying to recognize the boy he had lost, fighting against the torrent of emotions that threatened to drown him. It was as if the desert of his soul, where only guilt grew, suddenly found an oasis, or an abyss. Mary Johnson, once again, was the first to notice the resemblance in his gaze, the same silent intensity she saw in Smith's eyes. She kept her observation to herself, feeling that this was a moment they needed to face alone. Amidst the drought crisis and the uncertainty about his brother, nature once again intervened, paradoxically. An unexpected, violent, and sudden storm broke the cycle of extreme heat. It wasn't a sandstorm like the first, but a storm of wind and torrential rain. The creek that ran through the ranch, dry for weeks, suddenly overflowed with fury, turning into a raging river. The force of the water destroyed part of the buildings closest to the bank and threatened the corrals. It was a moment of chaos and imminent danger. Smith David, whose identity was still questioned by some, and Mary Johnson, along with the cowhands, worked side by side in the mud and rain to save people and animals. The icy water and strong wind whipped their faces, but the need to act suppressed fear. In an instant of pure urgency, while Smith struggled to loosen a board that blocked the passage of the water, he cut his forehead on an exposed nail. Blood mixed with rain. Mary Johnson, without hesitation, tore a piece of her own skirt and handed it to him to stop the bleeding. Their hands touched briefly in the gloom of the storm. His eyes met hers for a second longer than necessary, a silent recognition, a moment of mutual vulnerability in the midst of the element's fury. The simple gesture, the improvised bandage, marked a silent but profound change in their relationship. It was more than care. It was trust, partnership, a recognition that together they could face any storm. This was one of the 5 crucial moments of connection and trust. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a muddy landscape full of debris, but also with a fresh smell of wet earth and the promise that water, at least for now, would no longer be the immediate problem. The destruction came at a cost, expensive repairs and extra work, but the sense of survival and the unity forged in the crisis brought a strange relief. The resolution of the plot began to weave itself from this point. The supposed brother, David, seeing the genuine pain and guilt in Smith's eyes during the storm, and their joint effort to save the ranch, finally revealed his true purpose. He wasn't seeking revenge for the abandonment in the blizzard. He had survived, rescued by a distant Native American tribe, and spent years learning their customs and philosophy. Life in the Native American community, far from the bitterness of the civilized world, taught him about forgiveness and the importance of leaving the past behind. He had returned not to claim what he had lost, but to find peace, both for himself and for his brother. This major twist shook Smith's emotional foundations. The figure he had imagined for years, full of resentment and pain, didn't exist. Instead, he found a man who, like him, had been shaped by adversity, but who had chosen the path of healing instead of bitterness. It was a mirror that forced him to confront his own guilt and the need to forgive himself. The metaphor of the desert of his soul that he carried began to give way to fertile ground, ready for new seeds. The light of hope, previously weak, began to shine more intensely. Mary Johnson, realizing the inner transformation occurring in Smith, the crack in the hard shell that revealed the softer wood beneath, offered him a simple gift. It was an old canteen made of worn leather that had belonged to her father. He always said that hope is like water in the desert, she explained, handing the canteen to Smith. It's precious, and sometimes we'll only find it if we look for it with faith. The gesture, seemingly modest, carried the weight of a newfound trust between them. It was a symbol of the ability to nurture life in times of scarcity, not just of water, but also of hope and forgiveness. Smith accepted the canteen, feeling the worn leather under his fingers. He kept it close to his body like a talisman. This was the second crucial moment of connection, the exchange of a significant object loaded with symbolism and history. While the Smith family dealt with their reconciliation and the community with the consequences of the storm, William Davis wasted no time. He manipulated the town council, using his money and influence to divert the planned course of the railroad, threatening to isolate the ranch and drastically devalue its lands. It was his last move to force Smith to sell. The news reached the ranch like a blow, a reminder that external danger still lurked, even as internal tensions were starting to subside. This was the third moment of high tension, the final blow that threatened to destroy everything that had been built and rebuilt. But Smith, now with David by his side and Mary Johnson offering her silent support, didn't back down. Instead of direct confrontation, they devised a plan based on knowledge of the land, the strength of the community, and an innovative idea. They used Samuel's documents, which revealed the history of the water dispute and property boundaries to strengthen their legal position. David, with his years of learning with the Native Americans, brought irrigation and water conservation techniques that could transform the ranch and make it self-sufficient, reducing dependence on external wells controlled by Davis. And the community, united by the fear of being crushed by uncontrolled progress and inspired by the resilience of Smith, David, and Mary Johnson, found a way to use the small amount of gold that Jimmy had found. Instead of mining the vein on a large scale and attracting a dangerous gold rush, they offered it as an attraction for a railroad way station to be built on the ranch lands. A gold station, promising small nuggets for tourists and curious visitors, would ensure the railroad passed through there, benefiting the entire community without destroying the peace. It was a risky plan, but one that balanced tradition, respect for the land and community, with progress, the railroad, and new techniques. During a night of modest celebration for the arrival of the first steady rains after the drought, the air was fresh and clean, the smell of wet earth and green grass rising gently. The stars in the western night sky seemed brighter than ever. Smith and Mary Johnson found a moment alone, sitting on the ranch porch, listening to the night sounds of the countryside. They shared a moment of mutual vulnerability. She confessed her fear of never truly belonging anywhere, always an outsider, a traveling doctor. He revealed that his true wealth wasn't in the cattle or the land, but in the stories, the traditions, and the people he kept together. It was a confession of the soul, revealing the depth of their fears and the values that guided them. This was the third and fourth crucial moments of connection, the revealing conversation and the demonstration of mutual vulnerability. Under the vast starry sky, they saw in each other the same loneliness, the same resilience, and the same silent hope. The fifth emotional twist, and a crucial turning point for the ranch, arose when Smith decided not just to sell the idea of the gold station, but also to divide the property among the oldest and most loyal cowhands. He would turn the ranch into a cooperative, where everyone would have a stake and direct responsibility. It was a sacrifice of his absolute control, of the power he had held for so many years, but it represented his deepest personal evolution. He understood that preserving a way of life, the way of life of those plains, meant adapting it, not freezing it in time. It was an act of faith in his people and the future. This was the fifth crucial moment of connection with Mary Johnson as, well, an act of sacrifice that solidified the bond between them. She saw in this the true essence of the man he was, not just a stubborn foreman, but a visionary leader, willing to give up his power for the greater good. In a final gesture of trust, which sealed her commitment to the community, and with Smith, Mary Johnson decided to establish her permanent clinic on the ranch lands. She would combine the traditional wisdom of Samuel and other local healers with her medical knowledge, creating a healing center that would serve everyone. During the construction of the small building, a community project in which everyone helped, Smith and Mary Johnson worked side by side. There was a prolonged exchange of glances between them, a moment of silence that communicated more than words could express. A shared future based on respect, trust, and a love that had grown silently like grass after the rain was beginning to appear on the horizon. It was the light they had sought in the desert. David, the brother, fulfilled his promise, bringing irrigation techniques learned on his travels that, combined with Smith's expertise and the hard work of the cowhands, allowed the land to flourish in unexpected ways, producing harvests even in the driest years. Hope was no longer just a concept. It was something tangible, growing from the soil. Sheriff Wilson, seeing the new strength in the community and feeling the weight of the years, recognized that his time of individual leadership was coming to an end. He symbolically handed over his responsibility to a community council, composed of Smith, Mary Johnson, Tom, the village mayor, and other leaders. It was an important step, the transition from the law of one man to self-governance, where tradition and progress, old and new codes of honor, could dialogue and find a balance. Faith in the community had prevailed. When the first steel rails finally reached the region, Months later, they no longer represented a threat, but an extension of the community that had learned to adapt without losing its essence. The gold station, modest but appealing, brought visitors and commerce, but life on the ranch and in the village kept its pace. Smith, watching the train arriving in the distance, the sound of its whistle echoing across the plains, felt a peace he hadn't felt in 15 years. The debt hadn't been collected the way he feared. It had been paid with forgiveness, with sacrifice, and with the building of something new and stronger from the ruins of the past. Guilt hadn't completely disappeared, but it had transformed into a scar that reminded him of the importance of compassion and resilience. Mary Johnson was by his side, her blue eyes reflecting the vast western sky. Their hands met once more, not out of necessity, but out of choice. They had found their place, their home on that dusty land and under that vast, stern sky. The path of redemption hadn't been easy, but it had led to a destiny of light and hope. And you, when will you let hope bloom in your desert?